Okay, so thank you very much for including me in this wonderful conference. This is joint work with Patrick Francois and Francesco Trebbi, both at UBC. So my interest in this paper kind of stems from my interest in economic development, and specifically kind of the role played by weak institutions, weak political institutions. And the standard way perhaps to think of weak political institutions is via this dichotomy of democracy and autocracy, but sort of as many political scientists in fact have pointed out, this is a quote from a famous paper by Diamond, many democracies in modern times operate in this political grey zone, right? Somewhere between real democracy and outright dictatorship. And there's a bunch of names that I'm sure most of you here are somewhat familiar with that are intended to capture this phenomenon. So to give you a sense of the magnitude, a kind of an imperfect sense of the magnitude of these hybrid regimes, this is a measure of the proportion of countries that are classified as democracies via the Polity 4 data set, via the Polity 2 measure. So if you don't know, I'm sure you do, but this top line measures the proportion of countries for which score a positive score on the Polity 2 and therefore are traditionally classified as democracies, right? And so there's a lot of interest in this recent kind of third wave of democratization. The grey area are those countries that scored not above 0, but between 0 and 8, right? And so these are kind of these imperfect democracies. So to give you a sense, in 2012, if you got an 8, that puts you in the same league as places like Ghana, Indonesia, and so on. So not typically fully fledged democracies. You can kind of see from this as well, the variation in the proportion of countries that are classified as democracies is really kind of driven by this variation in the number of imperfect democracies. So these are not kind of randomly imperfect. These democracies kind of, and we point this out empirically in the paper, but I probably won't talk about it, is that these hybrids have got these systematic features, right? They're hybrid in a systematic way, and they hold these and respect regular, somewhat competitive multi-party elections. So there's turnover via elections, but pretty much every other element of democracy is lacking. So things like independence of the judiciary, freedom of speech and freedom of the media, respect for the rule of law, and so on. Okay. These political scientists have come up with some examples. They actually specifically call these minimalist democracies. This is based on the Freedom House data. And the purpose of this is just to show that these countries sort of exist across the world and in non-trivial numbers. But we're not going to be interested, at least today, in classifying them. Okay, so why is it interesting to study these minimalist democracies? Well, one possibility is that, especially in Africa, these imperfect democracies are just a representation of a learning process. You get elections, these countries don't really figure out how to get the full benefits of democracy, but with enough experience, they'll just eventually transition to full democracies. We're going to argue that there's an equilibrium logic that holds minimalist democracies together, and therefore this might be a stable long-run outcome. There's no reason to suspect a transition to full democracies. The reason this is somewhat interesting, I think, to study minimalist democracies is that this question of why is it that the political elite respect the wishes of the non-elite. Specifically, the non-elite, the citizens in these minimalist democracies, because they're not able to guarantee these sorts of freedoms, which they presumably like, they are in a sense sort of weak, right? It's not as if they're representing a strong threat to the government to the extent that they can ensure these fuller elements of democracy. So if they're kind of weak, then what motivates the elite to respect the elections? So what we do is just propose a model. It's very simple, that understands how minimalist democracies kind of hang together and how they might arise, how they might fall apart, and so on. And there's some component of empirical support as well. So again, in case we get lost in the details, these are the main things, the main ingredients of the model. So as I was saying, the main feature is that there is no threat from the masses. Right? So this puts us in contrast with Acemoglu Robinson, Fearon's work. Andrew has work on this as well. Egorov and Sonda in 2014, where elections are respected because of a threat of revolt from the masses. So that's not going to be here. Elections are not going to have any bite, right? So political accountability models that assume this, we're going to not assume that. The way we're going to get elections being respected is based on the idea that the benefits of office are not perfectly transferable, and leaders face coup threats. So the insiders among the political elite are able to seize office violently. Okay. And there's also a little bit of novelty in how we treat the way voters behave, given that we want voters to be important, but not via this channel, not because of a threat of revolution. So we need to somehow measure these two things. Okay, so what do we want the model to speak to? First of all, this question that's not really all that interesting, perhaps, given that it's plenty of other explanations as to why this powerful elite respect elections. And the mechanism is kind of a combination of well-known things. Because the leadership rents are non-transferable, the possibility of avoiding coups sometimes won't arise. So in some cases, coups will be unavoidable. Coups are going to destroy surplus, and that's the leader would always want to avoid that, to extract that surplus. And elections allow you to change the identity of the leader over time. So it's sort of like an intertemporal way in which to transfer rent. Okay, so these ideas are kind of known from Fearon's work on conflict and Przeworski and so on. I'm not going to pretend that this is the only explanation, right? Political scientists have many explanations for why the elite would respect elections. Maybe even if it's not based on popular protest, a lot of explanations rely on some sort of incomplete information. Right? You don't know how strong the opponent is vis-a-vis the leader, and the elections might reveal that, and that might give you incentives to hold coups and so on. We're going to have, this is not going to be information theoretic at all. There's going to be complete information. So we're going to be interested in characterizing the conditions under which this sort of scheme, which you can see would be particularly valuable, under what conditions does this scheme hang together in equilibrium? So when is there no incentives for those without power to seize power, and when is there incentives for those with power to respect the election? So a natural question comes up is, well, maybe we can just ignore voters altogether if they're so unimportant, and we can come up with some other scheme where the elite randomise, mimicking an election. So we have to answer some question of, well, what is it that elections add? What can incorporating voters do over and above what the elite could do themselves? And we're going to say this answer kind of relates to issues of renegotiation. So the model is very simple. It's going to be an infinite horizon, discrete time. The main players are massive citizens that are always there. At any date, there's the elite, and the elite is composed of two people. Just for simplicity, we can extend it. I can talk about that later. One's the leader and one's the insider. If you're the leader, you get to control the rents from office, composed of two parts. I'm going to call you patronage, just money, state resources that you can pay off whoever you like. And there's some other part, which I'm just going to refer to as power, which is non-transferable. So I'm the leader, I can't transfer the ego rent, if you like, associated with being the leader. So this parameter psi is going to be useful. It's the proportion of the benefits of office that are transferable. Okay, so within any given period, what's going to happen? The leader chooses how much to transfer from the feasible set, which is transfer nothing, or they can transfer all that's available, consumes whatever's left. The insider observes what was offered to them. They decide whether or not to mount a coup. If they mount a coup, they give up the offered patronage the upward transfer, and they succeed with some probability gamma. Whoever loses the coup, the leader or the insider, they die, and whoever wins becomes the leader next period. If there's no coup, if they die, they're replaced with kind of an identical person from their lineage. So the elite is replaced with somebody similar to them. If there's no coup, the leader then decides whether or not they want to hold an election, and whether or not and so given the outcome of the election, whether or not they want to respect it. They can't commit to respecting it or anything like that. Then everyone dies with some probability. Then this is just repeated. So the only thing I haven't told you then is how we treat elections. And this is going to be in a very reduced form sort of way. None of the interesting things that have come up in many papers here. We're going to capture this idea that citizens are kind of passive. They're like, well, this guy's not going to give me anything, this guy's not going to give me anything, I don't really care. So in normal times, the incumbent's going to be re-elected with some probability P. This can measure the extent to which there's an incumbency bias, or the extent to which the leader can manipulate things in their favour. And the only wrinkle is that if there's an unexpected refusal to honour the election, so unexpected according to equilibrium outcomes, then this is going to make voters reluctant to vote for that person again. You can think of many ways why this might be the case. What we're going to do is suppose there are just these two types of leaders, regulars or tyrants. Regular guys do what you're supposed to do in equilibrium. The tyrant guys just want power. So they'll never step down, and with some probability they get some opportunity to do something horrible that citizens don't like. So in equilibrium, if you don't respect the election when you were expected to, the voters update, they think you're a tyrant, and then you're strictly not preferred to the other guy, and you're not re-elected. Okay? Now this by itself is not going to be enough of a punishment, of course, because whether or not voters want to re-elect you doesn't matter, because you never have to respect the election anyway. So this is going to have an effect via an indirect means. So we're going to look at Markov perfect equilibria. The payoff relevant states can be summarized as the views of voters, right? The voters' perceptions of the two candidates. In this state, everyone's kind of got a clean slate, and you've re-elected with probability P. If you unexpectedly violate the election, you enter this state, in which case you're never re-elected until you die, and then we start back here. I'll be more specific about this. We're going to focus on two kinds of equilibria, autocratic and minimalist democracy. That's the more interesting of the two. So autocratic equilibria, these are important for understanding the motivations for a minimalist democracy. So here, no one's going to respect elections, or equivalently, no one holds elections. The insider may or may not hold a coup depending on how much they're transferred. So the Markov strategy is, because nobody's expected to respect an election, voters aren't surprised when you don't respect it, and so in effect we kind of stay in this one state. So it's very simple to write the Markov strategies. It's just a transfer that's offered every period, and a function that describes whether or not you coup depending on the transfer that's offered. These are sort of value functions. I don't want to kind of go through the definition of Markov perfect equilibrium is, but I'm happy to talk about it if you have questions. So in equilibrium, just some kind of preliminary features that come up. In any equilibrium, there's going to be some kind of endogenous threshold that you have to be, the insider has to be paid at least this amount in order to not hold a coup. Okay? And number one here is only the interesting one. It's that if it's strictly feasible to avoid a coup, so if the amount needed to dissuade a coup is less than what you have available, then in that equilibrium you will always pay that. So in other words, if there's a coup in equilibrium, it's never because the leader is taking a calculated risk. I'll rather keep everything and take the chance of you holding a coup. Okay? So in other words, coups arise only if and only if there's not enough patronage. So here's the formal equilibrium, but I think we can do it via a diagram. So here is psi, how transferable is patronage. Here's the incumbency bias. There are three kind of regions. When there's not much transferability, so when there's a lot of transferability, we get secure autocracy. So there are no coups, you have enough to pay off the guy. When there's not much transferability, you don't have enough. So you don't have enough to pay off a guy even when they anticipate becoming strongly insecure, and as a result, there are always coups. You keep everything and you face coups with probability 1. This is disastrous. Then there's this middle region where you pay everything and you face coups with a particular probability that makes everything work out. So this is weakly insecure. So it's these two regions that are kind of bad for autocrats and might motivate the use of elections. Okay, so getting to the good stuff then, in a minimalist democracy, both states are being used. How does this work? We're going to say this is the democratic state. This is on the equilibrium path. You're re-elected with probability P. If you don't respect the election, because you are expected to in equilibrium, we enter what we call the tyranny state, because you're perceived as a tyrant. And we show that you would never want to step down in this state. So therefore, we can kind of just ignore the other possibilities and just note that this will be absorbing, and this state will return on itself until the incumbent dies, either naturally or via a coup. And once that happens, then we can just go back to democracy and start again. So the Markov strategies are just the transfer in each state and these response functions in each state. Okay, so these are the value functions associated with each of those states and each of the players. What we're interested in, though, is characterizing the conditions under which these two necessary conditions for a minimalist democracy hold. So when is there going to be no coups? That's when this thing holds. And when our elections respected, that's when this holds. So if you do respect an election, you become the insider in a democracy. You have to prefer that to being the leader in the tyrant state. This one just says you prefer to get the equilibrium transfer, wait a period, perhaps die, and then next period with probability P, you stay the insider, but with 1 minus P, you become the leader, and so on. If you hold a coup, then with some chance you're a success, wait a period, and you become the leader. Same sort of thing. In equilibrium, you'll always pay off a guy if you're able to. So in understanding when this first condition holds, we just have to figure out when there's not enough patronage available to pay off the guy to avoid a coup. Here's all the junk, but I can do it again in the same diagram. We're going to have two regions. In this region, you can avoid a coup without making any transfer. The promise of coming back to power is enough. So even if the leader pays nothing, there definitely won't be a coup. If P gets really high, then the chance of the insider being able to come to power is very low. You'll have to pay him something. The higher you go, the more you have to pay. So that explains why this is kind of like this. This is what I consider to be the more standard of the conditions. You need enough patronage to keep people from trying to hold a coup against you. The second condition, self-enforcing, is when is it optimal to actually step down when you're supposed to. So what happens if you do step down, you become the insider. If you don't step down, you become the leader in the tyrant state. And what does this mean? You're facing a guy that can hold a coup and become the leader in democracy. So this guy is really hungry to kick you out because he wants to be the leader, right? But you may have enough patronage to pay him off to avoid him doing that. And so this lemma 4 just establishes this necessary condition that if it's ever possible for a leader in the tyrant state to pay off an insider, then they would never step down. Right? So it's necessary for this, for the leader in the tyranny state to be insecure. So therefore, they need insufficient patronage. Right? So this is kind of the opposite conclusion to the other condition. Right? So again, here's all the junk. I'll do it in the diagram. So in this region, S1, so we only have to consider those regions that are already shaded in, because if you're not in that region, you can't possibly support a minimalist democracy equilibrium. In this region, in the democracy phase, you're not getting transferred anything. So as P gets larger, the benefit of being the leader in democracy increases. You're not paying anything, and your tenure is more secure. You tend to return to power more often. So this is like raising the prize that the insider in the tyranny phase is competing for. This makes them more hungry to hold a coup. So to be insecure, you need to have less than some increasing function of P. At this phase here, you're kind of indifferent as a leader in democracy because your tenure is more secure as P goes up, but that's exactly compensated by the fact you're paying more. So that's why it's flat here. And I think this is the more novel of the constraints, and I'm going to kind of argue that the fact that this constraint is here helps us explain some things, particularly the emergence of these minimalist democracies. Okay, so that's necessary. When is it sufficient that this is going to be the set of parameters for which a minimalist democracy can be supported? So really the trade-off is, you're the leader, do I want to be the insider in democracy, or do I want to face perpetual coups as a tyrant leader? So if gamma, the chance of a coup being a success, is high enough, then of course you'll be dissuaded from being an insecure tyrant, and therefore this will be sufficient. So this is the specific condition. If that holds, then that set is also sufficient. If it doesn't hold, then what basically happens is there's an area, there's some critical P here, and everything below P will be supported, nothing above P will be supported. That's kind of a summary of what you need. The basic idea is you need patronage to be transferable enough and non-transferable enough, or also, equivalently, you need P, the incumbency bias, to be not too high and not too low. In the interest of time, let me skip this. I can talk about it if you like, but we assumed there was just two leaders. By incorporating more than one two elite, by incorporating more than two, all you're really going to do is change the willingness to hold coups, and therefore you'll change the precise nature of these conditions, but the conditions will still be there. And the way it's going to work out is fairly straightforward. Same sort of thing if we had asymmetries. Let me not talk about this because I want to talk about what are elections actually doing. So we've constructed this equilibrium where elections are effectively allowing the elite to randomize and avoid coups. Right? So you would think, well, the elite, the voters have got no power, so why don't we just ignore them altogether and have them toss a possibly weighted coin and just be done with it. So you could exactly replicate the equilibrium path by this sort of strategy, right? And the idea would be that if I didn't violate it, if I didn't respect the coin toss, there's a kind of a coordinated shift in beliefs where you think I'll never respect it again, and then you'll hold coups and so on. Right? But we say that like a weakness of this is this issue of renegotiation, right? So imagine we're tossing this coin and I violate the agreement. You have to punish me by holding a coup against me, but that's costly for you because you might die, right? It's costly for me as well. In fact, it's a Pareto improvement to go back to the equilibrium path, to say, let's forgive and forget, let's start again. Look, I'll be the leader next time, sorry, I'll just toss the coin again. Okay, so technically these agreements are not renegotiation proof. So certainly it's an equilibrium, but it's not great to the extent that it's not renegotiation proof. I should also point out that this coin toss captures this possibility of deterministic alternation just by setting P to 0. If P 0, then there's alternation period after period, so this argument sort of applies to that sort of case as well. So how do how do elections affect this renegotiation business? Well, just simply because voters are at arm's length, right? Their motivation is to vote for you or not. In effect, what this means is that this offer to return to the equilibrium path is just not there. You can't change the voters' perception. You can't tell them to forgive and forget. You can't convince them. They're at arm's length, right? So it's no longer an option to return to the path. So in a kind of a sense, this is a commitment to not renegotiate, and therefore makes these kind of agreements more credible. I want to mention one thing about the emergence of minimalist democracies. So I was saying, kind of claiming this is the novel constraint, and because of this, you can see that if we're in a situation where patronage transferability is like this red dot, if the available patronage, empirically we measure it as the price of the main commodity, if this falls, then we kind of move down to a point like this green dot, in which case minimalist democracy becomes feasible. So this would be consistent with this literature that discusses the political resource curse. A drop in available state resources leads to a shift in political institutions, but for us it's not just a shift to democracy, it's a specific shift to a minimalist democracy, right? And so in the empirical work, you'll probably realize that there are multiple equilibria here, right? So there's no, of course, if you reduce the available patronage in autocracy, you could just get a really crappy autocracy. You could get an insecure autocracy. That's also an equilibrium. So the fact that you would shift to a minimalist democracy has to rely on something else, and that is that this one is Pareto dominant over this one. So the extent to which you believe that kind of lines up. And this sort of mechanism or explanation seems to kind of roughly line up with existing work on the political resource curse, more discursive discussions of which African countries were able to maintain democracy. These are the ones without lots of natural resources. So just to advertise what we do in the last part of the paper is we use the motivation from this paper to measure patronage via the price of the main export, and we just replicate this for Africa, and we show that as the price of the main export goes down, state resources go down, you're more likely to become democratic, as measured by the Polity 2 score. That's replication. Over and above that, we use the Polity scores to divide democracy into the elements of democracy into more finer categories. So they measure the electoral component of democracy. They measure the kind of the inclusiveness and the constraints on the executive. We show that this reduction in state resources only increases the election component of democracy. Right? So this is sort of the new part, right? So it's at least consistent with this idea that greater state resources shifts to specifically minimalist democracy. Okay, so that's all I kind of wanted to present today. We wanted to understand what these minimalist democracies were all about, given this seeming contradiction that the citizens are not powerful enough to guarantee these civil liberties, yet were somehow powerful enough to ensure leadership turnover. And we argued this was the result of a game between the elites. Okay, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Chris. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss this paper. Also, I would like to thank you, Scott, John, and Tarun for organizing these series of conferences, because I think they are really a unique opportunity, especially for comparativists who are often substantively over a very wide range of subfields, to actually come together both across those subfields and generations. So I would like to start by briefly recapitulating the motivation for the paper and some key theoretical insights. So the motivation is that we have a class of regimes, I think since Przeworski referred to as minimalist democracies, because Przeworski et al. Have this criterion And they defensively call it a minimalist democracy because they are interested in the minimum criteria that you could have for a democracy, and for them it's elections and alternation. And it's an important category of countries because as Chris and his co-authors show in the paper, developmentally it seems like this is the aspect of democracy that comes first. We have first alternation in power, and then these many other things that we tend to associate with democracy. And also it works the other way around. Alternation in elections is usually the last thing before a democratic breakdown. Civil liberties and other freedoms disappear much earlier. It's also important historically because one way to think about minimalist democracies is these are aristocratic republics historically, where the elite, whatever that means, was governing and excluding a large fraction of the population, but they had elections. And finally, as Chris emphasized, today there's a lot of such regimes, and political scientists have a lot of fancy names for them, anywhere from hybrid regimes to illiberal democracies to competitive authoritarian regimes, and I don't know what else. So here's the key setup, just to remind you. So this is a game that happens over an infinite horizon. There are two key players, the leader and the insider. So the leader is the one person who governs. The insider is some other member of the elite who is, however, excluded from power. And then, I think, depending on how I read the paper, there's also the public, and that public also may be either non-strategic or strategic. And I wonder if this is maybe a fact of the history of the paper, that maybe there was some elements that were added later. The key aspect is that there are benefits from office, and they can be of two types, either non-transferable, so this is the pure value of being in office, so something like ego rents, and then transferable, that the authors usually refer to as patronage. So this is something that you can share with others if needed to help you stay in power. And then in each period, and I was actually not sure where this particular decision is made, so with some very small probability, the leader is either a regular leader or a tyrant. And the key feature that distinguishes the two is that tyrants never do good things for the public, so the public hates them. And this can happen with an arbitrarily small probability for the setup to work. The leader allocates patronage. Then the insider decides whether to stage a coup or not. Then the public votes and either re-elects the incumbent or replaces him with the insider. And finally, once that election is over, the leader decides whether to respect the election or not. And there are three equilibria, at least the way I see it, three types of qualitatively different states. There are somewhat more quantitatively that emerge. So either there's an autocratic equilibrium where there are no elections, but depending on how much patronage there is, the members of the elite, the leader and the insider, may decide to share enough of the transferable benefit from office patronage for this to be a stable situation. So we don't need elections. Then there's the democratic equilibrium. And I think one important insight from this paper is that two things have to be true for there to be a democratic equilibrium. First, the insider must not attempt to gain power, so it must be peaceful. And it must be self-enforcing, that is, the leader must not be tempted to disrespect elections when he's voted out of office and just decide to stay in office. And this last element is what connects the democratic to what I would call the tyrannical equilibrium, and that is what happens if the leader decides to refuse to step down after losing an election. And what happens in this case, because of the assumption about the role of the public, is that the key assumption is the public never votes again for a leader who disobeyed elections. And so what happens then is that if this is the assumption, then once a leader refuses to step down, there's the only thing that can happen is that, so now basically this randomization tool called the public is just one-sided, never votes for the incumbent. Therefore, the insider will now try to take the leader out, and this happens until the insider succeeds in killing the leader, or the leader dies because there's a delta probability of them dying in any period. So let me start by discussing the paper by explaining how I think about it in terms of belonging to the theories that we already have about democratization. So in terms of what I would call modern theories of democratization, I basically see there as being three literatures. One would be, in terms of the mechanism, would be the redistributive theories of Acemoglu, Robinson, and Boisch. Then we have some theories that are based on accountability. That is, the key role of elections is to deliver accountability, and that would be Fearon 2011 in QJE, or Rogers' model of federalism would be an accountability justification for a democracy. And then there are views that I would call power-sharing views of democratization, and that is the idea that elections allow elites to share power by allowing for intertemporal alternation in power, and Przeworski would be the main author there. Also, there we have these theories differ in terms of who are the key actors. So in some theories, like the power sharing, it's primary elites competing for power. Sometimes there are elites versus masses, as in the redistributive theories, and sometimes there's masses only. So, for instance, some of the Przeworski and a paper by Londrigan and Vindini, for instance, see elections as two groups of masses basically competing against each other, and elections are a way to do that peacefully, but without the costs of conflict. And finally, the nature of the conflict in some of these theories is generic. People just compete for power, whatever that means. In others, it's substantive, as in the Acemoglu and Robinson models, where it's really the owners of wealth against those who don't have it. And so I think that this paper, is primarily, at least in its claim, focused on power sharing among elites, and it's very generic. We don't really find out why is it that they're fighting for power, or if there's anything more that they want than power alone. Although, as I will try to explain, after reading the paper, I actually think it actually there's an accountability assumption that somehow comes in through the role of the masses. So it combines these two views. I think what the paper does really well is integrates what I would call the bargaining and intertemporal view of elections. So, as I mentioned earlier, the key element of the paper is that there are two types of benefits from office. And so one is the non-transferable one, ego rents, and the other is the transferable one, patronage. And I think one way to see this paper is to say, in fact, we could separate, two separate models, one that only talks about ego rents, non-transferable resources, and one that only talks about transferable resources. In the second case, we don't really need elections. In that case, we could have a bargaining game where the leader gives the minimal offer necessary to the insider in order to, that will make the insider happy enough to not try to take him out. And in that case, we don't really need elections. In the second case, where we only have ego rents, non-transferable rents, we need elections because there's no way to share ego rents, so you have to somehow alternate over time. And in fact, one of my suggestions for the paper would be maybe just to highlight that this fraction that you saw earlier that signified or that denoted the share of transferable resources as a total fraction of benefits from office, actually analytically it would be useful to separate the two and show that elections are only needed for the second part. And I think some other models that we have in the literature, for instance, the Przeworski model, actually do focus primarily on this case. And so I think this paper nicely integrates these two views and therefore presents a more general framework. One key emphasis here is that all of this happens in the shadow of costly conflict. In this paper, that's the idea that if the insider stages a coup, the patronage from that period is lost. And this is a common feature of these many other models. Conflict is costly, and therefore we need institutions, specifically elections. So what I like about this paper, just very briefly, is one, is that I think it actually has a very fair treatment of the political science literature, which is not always the case in papers written by economists. So maybe that's, I really like that. I think it offers a new rationale and mechanism for the resource curse. So briefly, the argument is that, the argument in the literature is, there are many arguments about resource curse, but one prominent one is that if you have resources, you can either use those to buy off the population or to pay agents to repress the population. Here, the population is not a threat, and so the reason why resources nonetheless pacify countries is that you can simply share them with insiders who will, as a result, not try to take you out. And finally, it introduces sort of a high theory concern about renegotiation that is refreshing, I think, and basically the idea that a lot of our models that rely on the grim trigger-like strategies in case somebody disobeys some kind of deal could be renegotiated, and maybe we should think more about the credibility of such threats if these punishments can be renegotiated. So let me say some more critical things, and the first one would be that although the intuition flows very smoothly throughout the paper, the math is really hard to follow. So maybe I would encourage my previous suggestion, that is, maybe it makes sense, at least initially, to just outline the case where there are only non-transferable resources, or when all resources are transferable, and then combine the two analyses into one that fully works out the trade-offs if both are present, or the continuum that when both are present. Also, one thing I expected and never got from the paper, but that's, it's not unfair as a criticism, I'm just stating the expectation. I was hoping to actually get a theory of a transition from a minimalist to a fall democracy. And so I understand that that's something that we should be doing in the future, but I think it's very important to do so. So let me focus on one very important assumption, and that is, what is the role of the public in this theory? So the argument is focusing on elites, but nonetheless has this key assumption that what the public does, it votes with a certain probability for the incumbent, but if the incumbent ever disobeys the election result, it never votes for him again. All right, so this is what the public does. And so really what the public performs, the role technically is it's a randomization device that allows for intertemporal power sharing. But at the same time, it ensures that this is renegotiation proof, because if the leader ever disobeys an election result, it is never willing to vote for that leader again. And this is just assumption. They're just an assumption. And there are several things about this assumption that I think are too strong. So the first is, one way that this is stated is a candidate's popularity among the voters is intuitively diminished if they violate an election. So as I said, this is an assumption, but it should have some political justification, and I can see how voters could dislike leaders who disobey elections, and that's their only role in the political setting. But on the other hand, if we take this intuitively dislike seriously, then voters also don't care that much if leaders come to power through a coup. Right, so I think that's a somewhat inconsistent assumption about what voters like and dislike. So another thing that's a part of this assumption, another element, is that although voters are supposed to be essentially indifferent about who is in power, ultimately the probability that they vote for the incumbent is allowed to vary between 0 and 1. And the way I would say is, if they're essentially indifferent, then they should be indifferent, right? But here they care about the incumbent or the insider with some positive probability. And one response to this is, well, our analysis is more general than that. I think that would be a justification. And finally, the claim is that this is an elite-based explanation, but since there's such a strong role played by the mass public because of this assumption, it actually ultimately introduces an accountability rationale for democracy. Right? And so the idea is that if the incumbent ever disobeys the election result, voters never vote for him again. This could be either assumed, or, as Chris and his co-authors argue, we could have this more extensive formalization where we assume that leaders are of two types, regular or tyrannical. Any leader becomes a tyrannical leader with a small probability, and with a small probability, that leader does something bad to the masses. And in that case, we can justify why, after observing a leader disobey elections, a voter would not want to vote for that leader again, because with a small probability, that leader does something that hurts the masses in the office. But this actually then introduces basically an accountability reason why voters want to get rid of certain types of leaders. It's a justification, but so this whole framework sort of starts with a very technical reason for being there, but then has a lot of political connotations that come with it. So let me discuss one element that is connected to this, and the reason that the masses never vote for the incumbent ever again if he disobeys an election result is this, that it makes the democratic equilibrium renegotiation proof, the tyrannical equilibrium renegotiation proof. That is, once this leader refuses to obey the result, the voters never vote for him again, which basically removes this randomization device that they had that allowed them to share power over time. Now they no longer have it, so they have to get rid of this leader because this leader has to try to stay in power because he can never be reelected again, which means people will want to take him out because he wants to stay in power forever. But I'm not sure here whether the concern about renegotiation is as serious as it is presented in the paper. And the reason is, and the authors recognize this, punishment is a Nash equilibrium, so there's no unilateral deviation that anyone would want to follow. Renegotiation is sort of a collective departure from this equilibrium, and I'm not sure how credible that is or how a serious concern that should be, even though it's Pareto superior, given that this is enemies. This is people who try to kill each other. So how do they find a way to talk and say, you know what, let's forget about what happened? In fact, maybe one way to reformulate the game that would not need this kind of renegotiation trick would be just to say that the punishment phase, rather than being repeated attempts by the insider to take out the leader, would be just a one-shot resolution of that conflict. And I think in that case it's more reasonable to believe that, well, they fight it out and it's over, somebody survives, and that person is the new leader. Finally, this kind of rule could also be applied to the elites. That is, we could assume that there are regular leaders and tyrannical leaders, and the tyrannical leaders are of the type that never ever shares patronage ever again, and this would introduce an incentive for the insider to then always want to punish the leader. So if the primary reason is technical, I would suggest there are sort of simpler solutions maybe to allow for renegotiation-proof power sharing than introducing elections. Another element in this setup is that leaders may disobey elections. This is when democracy ends. And I think there's actually a lot in that statement, because if we look at how disobeying elections happens empirically, it is almost never that there's an election, it turns out that the incumbent lost, and the incumbent says, no, I won, I'm staying. It's almost always that elections are manipulated in a way that will make it look like the incumbent won. So so if we could, so the only case I can think of is Burma, 1988, which was a legislative election when the junta allowed the election to be run, then lost, and then said, you know what, we're staying in power. But that's about the only empirical case that I can think of. So disobeying elections is actually a tricky thing. Usually disobeying happens in a way that leaves enough room for interpretation so that a lot of people could plausibly think, well, maybe the incumbent actually won. Since I have no time, let me just briefly say what I think is, the paper really made me think hard about to what extent it is reasonable to think about elections as a randomization device. And that is, I would think of that as being sort of the Przeworski's original point, and that maybe when we model elections, especially in democratization literature, we need to think carefully about what tool, when we need such a randomization and not. And so first of all, to share power, we don't need a randomization device, something that Chris recognized in the talk. We could just alternate in power, and this in fact happened empirically during the National Front period in Colombia, when the conservatives and the liberals decided, let's just alternate in power. And interestingly enough, they also held elections at the same time, and there was one election in which the wrong guy won, and nonetheless they alternated as they were supposed to according to the deal. So, but now there's also a lot of classical political theory that says elections are more than a randomization device. So for instance, Aristotle, but also Machiavelli, claimed the weakness of elections is that they empower the oligarchy or the aristocracy. So randomization, not elections, real randomization is the right thing to do things. That is, that will empower or disrupt the power of the oligarchy. So I think it's interesting to maybe criticize this view of elections as randomization, because it's actually a very, at least according to these thinkers, very imperfect way of randomizing, because it can be subverted. And finally, most of our views of elections actually say they are much more than a randomization device. That is, if all we need is a randomization device, then why bother with platforms, with mobilizing the publics, with insisting on the free media? That is, if that's all we need, it's a very cumbersome way to get it.
Okay, so Milan, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. That's really great. There's a lot of stuff to kind of chew over there. I guess if I take the main one, there seems to be, this is kind of common, this objection or reluctance to provide this assumption about if you violate an election unexpectedly, you're never voted for again. Right? And so this is actually far stronger than what we need, and we've had enough time now, enough comments like this, that we're right now working on being precise about the minimal requirements that we need to get the kind of results. So you can think of if you disrespect an election unexpectedly, you're not voted in with probability 0, you're voted in with some probability that's less than usual. Or you can think of there being some exogenous chance of being forgiven by the voters and you go back to the path, which I eventually know. So thinking through this, actually it doesn't matter at all that voters never re-elect the person, right? So even if you had some lower probability, the key thing that matters is that once you violate an election, the possibility for voters to punish you further is diminished. So if they punished you by re-electing you with a positive but lower probability, as long as that's the extent of the punishment they're willing to extend to you, then that's fine, right? Because you get into this state, you realize that now there's no consequence for violating the election, and then you won't step down. So all that's important is that when you violate the election, you have incentives to never step down. And again, all that matters is that there's no further punishment imposed by it. But this is all very green to me, so this is actually quite an excellent point. I also so just one other thing that I thought was interesting was expecting this transition to minimalist to full democracy, and that was actually kind of where we started from. But that was very kind of intractable. We're working on a class of models now that kind of gets at this. Empirically, though, what we do is use the polity data to classify regimes into minimalist democracies and so on. Full democracies, minimalist democracies, non-democracies, and some sort of residual category. And we show that, in fact, the probability of transitioning from a minimalist democracy to a full democracy is about a third of the magnitude of going from a minimalist democracy back to autocracy. So once we kind of figure this out, it's not clear that this is kind of an inevitable transition from one to the other. So we had to kind of really think much more carefully about what would trigger that transition. That's a good point.
Right. So I've got Torin, Ken, Andrew, and Jean-Guillaume. Torin.
So it seems that the kind of key thing you're focusing on is that P, if I understood things correctly, P is exogenous.
Yeah.
It seems to me that you could write down a model of minimalist democracy in which P was chosen by the leader, but he had to respect the outcome. So at the moment P is exogenous, if the leader doesn't respect the outcome, then
yeah, that exists. That's Jaworski et al. 2015.
Right. So that's kind of seems to be closer to the notion of minimalist. That's closer to the notion of minimalist democracy that Jaworski has in mind. I don't know. So
yeah, there's a new paper that just came out that does that.
Right. So, but here this should clearly also be an equilibrium, right? I can kind of manipulate P in some way.
Yeah.
But I have to respect the outcome, and if I ever don't respect the outcome, then
that's right. So that's a good point. So if you could choose P, so we're just kind of parameterizing it. So if you could choose it, you in fact would want to choose this P star, this intermediate level. There's no benefit from going further because you have to pay. But I think one thing that Jaworski had missed because he didn't model, at least in the '91 book, didn't model the consequences of not stepping down. So there it's all about you want to make P kind of really low. You want to give the person a good chance when they become an insider to come back to power. But here it says no, right? If that's the case, then you make someone that doesn't respect an election kind of secure, right? And so therefore that would make them not want to step down. So by considering everything kind of fully, we see that the P's that will work are not too high, not too low, and I guess you could figure out the optimal P would be this P star.
Just another quick thing. So the assumption here is that power is indivisible, that patronage is. It seems to me that power is also divisible. You could imagine the autocrat can construct a hierarchy where he also gives the insider some share.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to my point. I think your model is a model of a unitary state, minimal democracy in a unitary state. You might call it minimal democracy. And I wonder what would happen if you tweak the model to allow power to be transferable or somewhat transferable. And I have in mind the topic of Roger's talk yesterday, federalism, coming from American politics. In the early 19th century in the House of Representatives, the speaker was an autocrat but had to get reelected. And there were times early in the 19th century where the speaker, in order to secure re-election, decentralized the office, created the committee system in Congress as a method of decentralization in order to buy support. And so there are other instruments, I guess, available beside bribing the insider to deter coups, by which a leader might sustain power by being able to transfer some of this.
Yeah, so I'm not, unless I misunderstand it, I'm not really persuaded by this renegotiation argument. Because why can't our renegotiation be, forget these elections, let's go to start flipping this bias coin? I don't see why it's like we're stuck with elections, like that can't be renegotiated. And so I think the election hasn't really purchased us anything. It's just like taken away the availability of one coin. And so then one answer to why you hold elections because they generate information. And I wrote a bunch of papers about that. So I will say.
Can I
Well,
answer these?
sure.
Because my memory's terrible.
Okay.
I'll forget it. So going backwards, if you just use the coin, that wouldn't be renegotiation proof, right? Because I could always just say to go use the coin again. Right? So if the elections don't work, I can say let's go use the coin, but I anticipate precisely that the coin's not renegotiation proof. So
how is the election renegotiation proof? Because
because once you piss off the voters, you can't use that same technology. That's the whole point.
But you can use another technology.
Not that you can't use one that is renegotiation proof. You can flip a coin, that's not renegotiation proof. You can use a different device for sure, but this device is not going to be renegotiation proof, so it's worthless. What is the memory of that? If you could erase the memory.
To finish up, I'm sorry, but we see a lot of elections that were like the electoral outcomes are not respected, like they have massive fraud and people still keep turning out. So I mean, I see that in the model and the assumption kind of like that works out, but like really like I mean I had the same problem before. So I don't see why. I mean I see it's by assumption, but I don't like and say because you cannot use it again. But if you look at the data, people keep going and voting. There's massive fraud and over and over and over and over. So like clearly, I mean they didn't get the message that that they shouldn't be keep turning out because it was flawed once. Yeah. So I just don't see that. So I think you're putting on the table something saying, we have to think about it, but I don't think that you successfully resolve that.
But if the elections are expected to be fraudulent, then that's fine, right? Because you don't have to be punished. It's only when in equilibrium you're expected to respect them, and then you don't respect them. Like in the autocratic equilibrium, you're not expected to respect the election, and so therefore nothing changes.
But also, what's the fine line between fraud and just not respecting an election? Like.
So fraud would be like an increase in P. If you want to endogenize this P, you can push it.
No, empirical. This is an empirical issue.
It's whether the fraud is expected or not, right? So Saddam Hussein's elections, he got 100% of the vote and huge turnout, right? Because people were like, he's obviously not going to turn out keys to the kingdom, right? He might as well show up.
Yeah, but from a perspective,
those aren't the kind of elections that we're trying to model.
No, I know, exactly. But Horatio is sort of saying, well, the fact that there are these kinds of elections is a refutation of the kinds of elections that are being used here. And I'm like, no, there are multiple types of elections.
But then you get to pick ones you work for you, right?
No, I mean, the Saddam Hussein elections cannot be used in this model, right? There's nothing to them. So the point is that Saddam Hussein, Iraq was not a minimal democracy. Right, it was an authoritarian regime that had a show of elections every 5 or 6 years. It was like carnivals. Right, so the fact that people turn out for fraudulent elections is an interesting behavioral question. But Saddam Hussein was not using that for the types of minimal democracy support that elections are being used for here. That would be my response.
Okay, so yeah.
I guess I have a narrower reason why I'm not necessarily convinced by the renegotiation claim. So you have a player, the voter, that's indifferent between all outcomes, right? So that means that there's no strict Pareto improvements that are possible. So in fact, any equilibrium of that game is going to be renegotiation proof sort of by construction, right? So imagine that the voter had an epsilon cost from coups, right? Tanks in the street and this kind of stuff. Then in that case, your equilibrium would be prey to the same kinds of concerns that you claim, say, a purely correlated equilibrium between the elite, the two elite members are, right? So I guess I'm saying this because you could think about your game without the voters is something like a repeated pie sharing game where the alternation is kind of the share, right? So a lot of people there will look at, say, the best subgame perfect equilibrium, right? So you're looking at correlated equilibria of this game, right? So you, in a way, the role for elections and what you're doing is this gap between what you can do with Nash equilibria, subgame perfect equilibria, and what you could do with correlated equilibria, right? And so that it just seems to me maybe taking a look at that gap might be something that's interesting.
Well, I'll have to talk to you more about the technicalities of this because I'd never thought of a correlated equilibrium as being related to this kind of at all, or the fact that voters are essentially indifferent. It sounds like, I'm not sure.
Okay, I could be in left field. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Chris.